Imagine for a moment that you're the editor of the Tribune Courier in Benton, Kentucky. It's 1983. It's about this time of year. A man that you think to be somewhere in his 60s or 70s walks into your office. His name is Ben Walters. He's from Cypress, California, and he says emphatically, "I'm looking for my pieces." Tell me, Bobbie, what was that story all about?
That Ben Walters story was one of the saddest stories I ever had anything to do with, ever wrote about or interviewed people in regard to. Ben came into the office, as you say, and telling the receptionist who he was, and she let me know that he was waiting, wanted to see me. And he came into my office and he said, "I'm Ben Walters from Cypress, California. I'm looking for my pieces." Well, I was rather startled by that, but then I invited Ben to sit. He was very personable type gentleman, and I invited him to sit down and tell me about it. He said, told me the story of how his family was split asunder in the summer. Appeared to be the summer of 1934 on the courthouse lawn. He said his mother was mentally ill, and the backstory on that was that she was an embarrassment to her brothers that lived in the same community. And in that period of time in Kentucky, the county judge had judicial powers. That there was a county judge, a city judges, and such. It was not until 1976 that the new Kentucky judicial order was passed, and the judges, the court system was reformed. And city judges and county judges were done away with, and district judge took the place. A district judge at that point had to be an attorney. Before that, the county judge was not necessarily an attorney, and most of the time he was not. But as Ben told me, at that time, the county judge had the power of life and death, so almost, so to speak, over your life if he so chose. And apparently the county judge, the family of Eula Walters were so embarrassed that they had asked the county judge to involuntarily commit her to the mental health institution in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, for the mentally ill, and to take the younger children from the family and take them to Louisville to an orphanage to have them adopted out. That's the short story of it. But Ben told me that on the court, they were brought into Benton on that fateful day. George Walters begged and pleaded and actually fought with the authorities there, who were loading his children and his wife into a black automobile. And he then was immediately jailed. And the older children, that Ben's age, Ben being 15, and I think there was a sister 17. There was 4 older children that were not loaded into the car. They were left with their with the family, to stay with their father. And the baby brother, name was Billy. He was literally wrenched from his mother's breast on the courthouse square and put into the car with these younger children and they were taken away. Well, naturally, the remaining siblings and George Walters were devastated. But George Walters was kept in jail, and the next day he was released. And the older children who remained with him, and he immediately started actions to find out where the children were and how they could get them back. Well, they were having no luck, and eventually, about the first of the next year, early in the next year, and this trying to find out where the children, exactly where the children were and how they could get, was a mystery. Nobody would tell them anything. Nobody that they went to, nobody that they contacted would tell them anything. The adoption from the beginning, when an adoption is begun, and then those records were sealed, and it was a hard seal. I have in my lifetime heard other adoptees tell me how difficult it was for them to get information about their birth family, about their biological families. But anyway, these particular children, these were not children that the parents didn't want. These were children that were wanted children. It was a poor family, and they didn't have the money for expensive attorneys or someone to fight their battles for them. But they themselves, these older children, including Ben, wrote letters to the orphanage in Louisville, and to others that they came in contact with, and they learned, by the next year they sold some animals that they had on the farm, and all farms at that time had a few chickens, a few pigs, and a cow or two. Even the poor farmers had those type of animals because they helped to provide something for the table for the family to eat. But they sold their animals, and they went to Louisville, and they went to the orphanage, and asked for their. Ben and the older children asked for their siblings, and Ben asked for his children. How could he get his children back? And the orphanage turned him away, saying that they had already been adopted. Well, they learned by some way that one of the children, one child, was still at that particular orphanage, and they began sending letters to the orphanage to that particular child. They never got a response, never any response. And Ben told me that as time went on, they continued their search in the best way that they knew how, because there again, they had no legal stand. The powers that be said they had no legal standing. Their fate had been dealt with. Their case had been dealt with, and that was the end of it. The records were sealed. There was nothing any authorities was going to do. Any authority was going to do for them, and but they did not give up. They continued their search, writing to anybody that they could find, anybody that might have seen anything of their siblings. And at the same time, Ben tells me that his mother, he said that his mother was mildly schizophrenic, is the way he said. One of the charge against her was that she laughed at inconvenient times. She laughed when there was nothing amusing being said, and this was embarrassing to her. But they were able to see her on visitation times at the hospital when they could manage to get away to Hopkinsville and see their mother. They could see her from time to time. Ben said his mother never had another lucid day after the children were taken away. And you can imagine that being true. It's still to this day causes me to tear up when I think about it. But having something like that happen to you, and having no power to do anything about it. Ben Walters did what he could. He fought for his physically as well as arguing, but he was jailed, and that cut him off. He could do nothing more, but he was released, and the search began. Ben tells me, I've been looking for 50 years. And he had found several of his brothers and sisters. By this time, they were adults, of course. And Ben had spent much of his life in the military. As he got older, then he didn't cease trying to writing letters mainly to different people, trying to locate his brothers and sisters during the period of time that he was in the military. After he was released from the military or discharged, he made his home, he married, made his home in Cypress, California. And he would travel back to Marshall County every year. He told me he had been traveling since he had been had enough money to come back, since he had gotten out of the military and been able to be on his own and make the trip back to Marshall County. Well, he came back, and so I was one of the people that he was contacting. His family had contacted the newspaper in the early years, in the 30s, looking for information, but for some reason they had not been able to get any information. They thought there had been news articles, but I looked as much as I could through our files, the big books that had files there at the office of the back papers. Well, we didn't have anything at that time back to the 30s, but I found out that had happened because the owner of the Tribune, Democrat at that particular time, it would have been, but at some point the publisher didn't really have enough money to have the newspapers bound into those big file books, and so he had just left the papers stacked up in a storage area, and he was going, when he had the money available, he was going to have them bound. Well, he had a young person working for him one summer, and the young person was cleaning out the storage room and burned them. So those newspapers were destroyed. I did tell Ben that they might have been microfilmed by the King Library in Lexington. I could not find out for sure whether they had been or not. And I did ask him to check with the libraries at Murray State University, and he said he had already done that. He hadn't been able to find anything through the library at Murray State. But anyway, he went on to tell me about this story, and that he had he was there in the county to talk to anyone he could who might be able to help him. He asked that I write his story and inform the public. Many of the people would not have remembered, many of the people in Marshall County that were subscribers to the newspaper would not have been in Marshall County at the time that this tragedy befell his family. So, but anyways, so of course this was a story. This was an amazing story. And I did write about it. And he was seeing Mike Miller. By that time, Mike Miller was county judge. Mike, this was not in the 1983, this first visit. And he was going to see Mike Miller. This was going to be his first visit with Mike Miller as county judge. Mike Miller was going to help him. He said in fact, he had already talked with Mike, but he hadn't sat down with him. And Mike said, yes, I'll do what I can to help you. Well, Mike had connections. Mike Miller was probably the first modern day judge executive after the new judicial article was passed. Well, Mike Miller actually, for a few years, let's see, the judicial article was passed in 1976, went into effect in 1976, and Mike was elected in 1973 and became judge exec in the beginning of 1974. So he made sure that he had connections in Frankfort. So he told Ben he would help him. And Ben went from my office to Mike's, and he was going to see Toad Bryan, who at that time was the circuit clerk, and see what records Toad might be able to come up with. Toad told him he would help him, and as if he would do whatever he could, and he would refer him to anyone in Frankfort that who might be able to help him. Well, Ben, I didn't see Ben again until the next year. But he did stay in touch with me. I did receive letters from him from time to time telling me he was still looking. And on that first visit, he had left with me a book that he had written, and the name of the book was The Glass Snake. And are you familiar with the legend of the glass snake?
I am not.
Well, in the eastern part of the United States, there is a myth of a snake that when hit will scatter into pieces. And then the head of the snake will instinctively go about gathering his pieces. And that's where Ben came up with, I'm looking for my pieces. And that's what he called his book. And in this book, he told the story of the separation of his family. And so he came back the next year, and we sat down and talked. And he had found all of his all of his brothers and sisters, and he had help by this time from some people who dealt in locating locating biological parents and siblings and kin of adoptees, because during that period of time there were many adoptees who were looking for their biological roots. And so he told me he had found them all except his baby brother, and Billy, he called him. And Billy was the baby brother who had been taken from his mother's breast. And he had learned that Billy had been ill shortly after. And you can imagine a child that's being breastfed, being taken immediately, just suddenly off the breast and given formula, or maybe just raw milk, milk possibly from the grocery. We really don't know what the orphanage was doing to feed a child that young, because Billy was in the neighborhood of 5 or 6 months old at that time, and when he was taken. And Ben had found them all, and now they were all looking for Billy. And Ben found out, as he found these siblings one by one, he found that they had been looking also. They had been writing letters. They had been looking. At one point, when he made a trip to the orphanage in later years, he was given a package of letters that the family members had written to the orphanage, and they had just been stacked up. Some of them never even opened. And Ben received some of his letters back, but the letters had received no action whatsoever. Anyway, so we talked again, and he told me that he was still looking, and he had a national organization. He declined to name that organization because it was an organization that does detective work, but it's very, I don't even know if it still exists, but it stays out of the limelight. It wants no publicity. This particular organization was an undercover organization that was helping people who had no other way of finding help. So this year passed, and I wrote again about Ben Walters, and visit from Ben Walters. Enjoyed talking with him, and of course through the next year received letters from Ben, sometimes letters to the editor about just other things that Ben was interested in, but he always mentioned his family. And so then in 1986, I believe it was, he came into my office, and there was a younger man with him. And I knew immediately there was such a resemblance. I knew immediately he must have found Billy, but he brought him in, and he had found Billy. And apparently that someone through this organization had been talking to him at one point and just held his hand out to him, and there was a name on the hand. It was Orville Hillman, and he lived in Texas. And Ben immediately, with the help of this organization, started contacting every Hillman they could find. He did find out that this man lived in Houston, Texas, and started telephoning every Hillman that they could find, and they found him. And when Ben went to meet him, he knew that Billy knew that he had been adopted, but he didn't know the story. he didn't know the story of being taken to the orphanage. He apparently had been adopted while he was still quite young, because he still told Ben that the people who raised him, they were his parents. Well, you could understand that, but Ben told me, and Billy nodded, telling me that when he was telling Ben when they met, and he was telling Ben that he didn't believe that. No, he didn't believe that. His wife said, "Look in the mirror." Mm. And so that year, the Walters children had a reunion, and they were all still living. Had a reunion in Indiana, and some of them were living in Indiana, and one of them had a large farm. In the search, and as he was finding these siblings, he found one who was an executive with IBM, and most of them had had their names changed. For example, Billy being changed to Orville Hillman. Anyway, that most of them had had their names changed. Well, James Crow was an executive, an engineer with IBM, and apparently had received several patents for IBM for various maybe computers and that sort of thing, and was well known in the IBM family and in the engineering circles. But anyway, they were all there at the farm this brother owned in Indiana, and had a big reunion, and they were all together again. And as I said in the beginning, it was a terrible, terrible story, and a terribly sad story, but it did have a happy ending. Unfortunately, the parents had passed on. Eula died in 1957, and the father, George, passed on a few years later. But that he continued until his dying breath to look for his children, Ben told me. And so I felt like maybe I had one small role in just, if for no other reason than just listening to what he had to say and running his letters to the editor and writing an article about him. I never had anyone call me and tell me I know something about this story. I never did. So I don't know if there were any relatives still living in Marshall County, or if there are today or not. But anyway, after I stayed in touch with Ben for a few years after that, but sort of lost contact, and I learned that he had passed on then a few years later. But it did.
How many children were there total?
9.
9 children. And they were from Hardin, Kentucky?
The Hardin area.
Outside of it. Yeah.
Yes, the Hardin area, a farm near Hardin. Yes, yes. Marshall County people, they were poor in 1934. Most farmers were poor in Marshall County. Wow. Marshall County was a poverty-stricken community in the 1930s. And that was the year I was born, so of course I don't remember that, but I do. Excuse me. I do remember that when I was growing up, we were not very affluent family. We lived on a farm. We did have plenty of food because my dad raised it. And on the farm, he owned a large farm, and we had food, but we didn't have any money to spend. My dad was also a teacher, and teachers, I can remember when my father earned $60 a month as a teacher. So, wow. So that didn't go very far, even in the 1930s and 40s. $60 a month. So anyway, the Ben Walters story is one of the sadder stories that I covered in my career, and in a way, it had a happy ending. The siblings were all together, in the end for a little while of their lives.